Now, in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, that there's no good argument that atheism is true.
Are there good reasons?
And secondly, that there are good arguments that atheism is true.
Are there, do you think?
Now, most carefully, the circumscribed limits of those contentions. We're not here tonight to debate the social impact of religion or Testament ethics.
Hey gang, welcome back to my channel. You know, I need to find a better intro. I'm not really happy with that one. I've been trying to mess around. I love the way that Christopher Hitchens starts his debate talks. He's like, friends, you know, what does he say? He says, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, friends, comrades. I love that brothers and sisters part. That sort of idea that we're all brothers and sisters in the human race, but that sort of excludes trans people or non-binary people. And so I'm not sure it works. Anyway, that's really not the point of why we're doing this today. This is the first video in my series on the Dr. Craig debates, Dr. William Lane Craig debates. And in this one, we are going to be looking at Craig's tactics and style that he brings to the debates. And as I mentioned in my other video, I think this is fair game for him because he uses these tactics and styles as a way to try and win the debate. So I think it's fair to critique them and to point out where he's doing them and what he's doing. Now, for this video, I'm going to be using clips from his debate against Frank Zindler. And I was going to use clips from a bunch of different debates because he uses the same script in every debate. But honestly, that looked like way too much editing, way more than I had the time and energy to do. So for each of these videos, I'm just going to stick with clips from one debate. But his message is consistent. His pitch, his script is consistent across every debate that he does. That's like God versus atheism, or is there reasons to believe in God, that sort of thing. I am going to put a card, if I can remember, to the Zindler debate, and down in the description I'm going to put a link to a playlist for all the debates that I'm using for this series. With that out of the way, let's get into reviewing the debate. Now, this part that we're going to start with is with Craig's opening remarks, and he went before Mr. Zindler. He is the first speaker in this debate. And he starts right here in this section by defining his terms.
In tonight's debate, we've been asked to assess the question where the evidence points to atheism or to Christianity. Now, before we can answer that question, we need to have some idea of what we're talking about. So let me begin by defining some terms. First, by Christianity, I mean the view that God exists and has revealed himself decisively in Jesus Christ. We're not being called upon to debate fine points of doctrine which Christians themselves differ on, like is the Bible inerrant, or did God use evolution to create living things? These are of secondary importance in comparison with the fundamental truth that God exists and has decisively revealed himself to us in Jesus Christ. Secondly, by atheism, I mean the view that God does not exist. On the atheist view, there is no such being or person as God.
Now here we see Craig doing what I think is a very important thing to do in this debate, and that is defining his terms whenever we have these kinds of discussion, because language is nuanced and complex, because these philosophical positions and ideas are complex and varied. It's very important to define how that you're using the terms. The problem here is that he is going to take his definition for atheism and apply it to his opponent's position. he's trying to force his definition into the debate instead of waiting for his opponent to define his own position and work with that. And this is going to be problematic. You're going to see this coming up over and over through the course of the debate. Now we'll move on to the next section. And again, this is Craig's playbook. So let's get into it.
I'm going to defend two basic contentions in tonight's debate. Number one, there's no good evidence that atheism is true. And number two, there is good evidence that Christianity is true.
Now, this is an excellent way to present your information. Craig is opening with his thesis for the debate. This is the proposition that I'm going to defend going forward. It's like anytime you're writing a thesis paper, you start with an introductory paragraph, your supporting points, and then your closing paragraph, which repeats your opening paragraph. And that's exactly what he's going to do here. But so as far as presenting the information to the audience, this is a great way to do it so they will pick up on what you're trying to say. It's an excellent speaking technique, but in the context of this debate, he's actually being kind of clever and tricky with this because he is setting this up as a metric for who will win and lose the debate. I've got these two propositions. There is good evidence for theism. There is no good evidence for atheism, Christianity in this case, which is also a little awkward, but I'll come to that later. And he's going to set this up as the metric for the win-loss of the debate. And this is important for Craig because, as I've mentioned before, he definitely comes to debates looking at them as academic competitions, almost like sporting events. And as I've said before, I don't fault him for trying to use tactics and strategies in this. I mean, would we fault a poker player for bluffing? Would you fault a football coach for running a play fake? It's part of the game. It's part of the strategy. You're doing it in a way to win and lose. And there's nothing wrong with looking at debates as academic competitions. That's a perfectly fine thing to do. So I don't mean to impugn any of Craig personally with this. Some people do. Some people call it dishonest. I don't think it is. I think it is got to do with his view of debates and how he approaches them. So let's move on to the next section.
Let's look then at my first basic contention. There's no good evidence that atheism is true. The claim that God does not exist is just as much a claim to know something as is the claim that God does exist.
Now here we see Craig definitively taking his own definition of atheism and pushing it on his opponent. And this is a potential straw man because we don't know what his opponent's position is yet. Although, as we'll see in a few moments, Craig actually does know what Mr. Zindler's position is. So he's intentionally creating a straw man, and he's intentionally trying to box Zindler into a position where he has to defend something that he doesn't necessarily hold as a position of his own.
Therefore, if Mr. Zindler is to maintain that the evidence points toward atheism, he's got to do more than just say there's no good evidence for God's existence. He must present evidence against God's existence.
Now here we see the first open salvo from Craig towards Zindler, where he's forcing this definition of atheism onto Zindler and saying that just saying there isn't sufficient evidence for God isn't enough. And under Craig's definition of atheism, that is the positive claim that gods do not exist, that might be true, or even there it's kind of a nuanced situation. It's not necessarily true. So Craig is very much confining what he wants his opponent to do and trying to fence him in.
He's therefore simply mistaken when he says in the Tribune that atheism makes no claims, and so it has nothing to defend.
So this, I think, is somewhat duplicitous on Craig's part. It's clear that he has read Mr. Zindler's work, and he knows how Mr. Zindler uses and thinks of the term atheist. And he is trying to force, in the course of this debate, Mr. Zindler to use Dr. Craig's definition instead of his own. Craig definitely prepares for his opponents when he does a debate. You can see this here. He has read some of Frank Zindler's work. You can see it in his debate with Christopher Hitchens. He makes some opening remarks in his opening statements, and that will be in the playlist down there, that are clearly directed at Christopher Hitchens because he's familiar with his work. So Craig prepares not only for the subject that he's going to be talking about, but for the opponent that he's going to be talking to. And this is another tactic that he uses. The fact that Craig took the time to clearly define how he was using the term, he had information prepared with like a dictionary definition of what he feels term should be used, means that he knows that there's nuances to how this term is used, and he's familiar with Mr. Zindler's work, and he's attacking a straw man here. It would be much better before the debate for the both interlocutors to agree on how the terms are going to be used in the debate, and then you're dealing with substance and not arguing over definitions. Now, this debate was in 1993, so that's almost 30 years ago now. And this was well before the rise of the new atheists and well before the concept of the lack of belief atheism really got cemented in the zeitgeist of the atheist-theist interchanges that are going on and the academics of it. So I don't know if William Lane Craig still would take this tactic today. I don't think it's fair of me to assume that he would, but he did here. And it's worth pointing out here that he knew that Zindler was using the word differently in any case. So let's move on to the next clip.
Atheist philosophers have tried for centuries to disprove the existence of God. But no one's been able to come up with a convincing argument. So rather than attack straw men at this point, I'll just wait to hear Mr. Zindler's response to the following question. What is the evidence that atheism is true?
Now here we see Craig trying to box Zindler in once again. He wants Zindler to answer his specific question. And he's being clever, I suppose. He's being strategic here in the way he sets this up. He says, instead of attacking straw man, I'm going to wait for Mr. Zindler to answer my question using my definition of atheism. And even though he says he's going to try, even though he says he doesn't want to attack straw men, he is actually attacking straw men in the process of doing it. But the information he's relaying to his audience, unless they're listening very carefully, is that he's not attacking straw men. That's why he says that up front. Instead of attacking straw men, I'm going to wait for my opponent to answer this specific question. If you really didn't want to attack straw men here, Dr. Craig, what you should say is, instead of attacking straw men, I'm going to wait for my opponent to explain his position, and then I'll address the substance of what he has to say. Instead, again, he's trying to box Zindler into a very specific, narrow lane, and he's going to use this tactic later on down in the debate. Now we're coming to a moment in Craig's presentation of the cosmological argument, and we're not going to cover the cosmological argument here. That is going to be a separate video. But what I wanted to point out, this is one of Craig's go-to style tactics. I want you to watch as he makes his statement, his facial expression, his body language, and his vocal tones. So let's look at the clip.
Now, I put it to you, which is more plausible? That the Christian is right, or that the universe just popped into being uncaused out of nothing? I at least don't have any trouble assessing these probabilities.
Notice, if you will, the smirk on Craig's face, the sound of a barely suppressed laughter in the tone of his voice, and his body expressions as he's moving through this. He is communicating far more than he is saying with words. He's saying that my opponent's position is so incredibly laughable, it's all I can do to not burst out here. It's mockable. It's ridiculous. It's clownish. It's buffoonish. Craig does this all the time throughout his debates. It's a way he has of trying to disarm his opponents, trying to undermine their positions by making them seem ludicrous, sometimes without actually addressing the substance of what's going on, or sometimes in this clip, actually, where he's attacking a straw man, again, attacking a straw man. He's created a false dichotomy. We'll get into this in the cosmological. That's not really, that's an aside point. But he does this all the time. This belies the fact that Craig is very much aware of something, and I think a lot of his opponents and a lot of people that do these debates are not always aware of. These debates are largely performance events. They're theater. And Craig is very well aware of this. And he is bringing theater to the stage. These moments where he's like barely laughing with his grin on his face, like it's so stupid, this is crazy. He knows he's performing for an audience. And he's winning points this way by making his opponents seem foolish and by getting the audience to internally laugh at these crazy, ridiculous things that he's bringing up. Not everyone knows this. Not everyone does this. A lot of people come to these thinking that they're strictly like academic exchanges, the exchanges of ideas, but it is theater, and Craig knows that.
In conclusion, then, we've yet to see any evidence that atheism is true.
Well, of course not. His opponent hasn't even made their opening statement yet. This is the end of Craig's open, which came before Mr. Zindler. And he's saying, well, we haven't seen any proof of atheism yet, before Mr. Zindler has even had a chance to speak. Again, this is a tactic and a strategy. He's continuing to try and box him in, to bottle him in, to discredit him before he even gets a chance to speak.
And we have seen 5 lines of evidence which suggest that Christianity is true.
Hey, gang. Dan from the future here, even though I may not look like I'm from the future because I think I have the same shirt and suspenders on, and obviously the hat is still the same. But I've been consulting with a friend of mine who's actually done debate, and he brought up some finer points in these debates, and I wanted to kind of add them into the stuff that I already had in this presentation. So I'm just adding a little section here that wasn't recorded with the original section. So the thing I want to talk about here is Craig's use of what's called shotgunning. And you see this sort of in his approach, and we really haven't given all of his 5 elements that he talks about in supporting his initial claim. My focus was really on his setup with those claims. But the fact is, he just does a huge dump of information. And commonly in debate circles, this is known as either a gish gallop or shotgunning, where you just overload your opponent with so much information they can't possibly respond to all of the points that you're making in the time allotted. And here he's basically unloading 5 major points, and each one of those is sort of like a shotgun blast with all these mini points underneath it. And he's counting on the fact that his opponent's not going to have time to respond to all of this, and at least one of his shots is going to stick. And by his metric, he declares victory at that point. Another thing he likes to do is cite a ton of sources. And we'll see this more as we go through the 4 arguments and 1 appeal to emotion that he includes in his presentation. Each of those will be a separate video. But he will start by citing sources for commonly agreed upon positions, but tons of them, and across a broad spectrum of fields, of disciplines, like psychologists, therapists, physicists, astrophysicists, chemists, whatever, theologians. It just requires a broad range of academic specialties, and he'll just dump all these in. But then he'll get to the point where he starts making claims without citing sources, and his audience and opponent sometimes are just so overloaded with the citations that he's already given that they've stopped looking for them, and they just assume that these are cited like the earlier things that he cited. And he's also lending credibility to his position by he's lending a feigned credibility to his position. It's an artificial credibility by citing all these sources. And he'll cite sources in the beginning of a thing, and then those sources will drift away, and he'll push his points past the point where those sources might not actually agree with him any longer. And one of the ways he definitely does this is in the cosmological argument. You know what? We'll get to that when we get to the cosmological argument, because I've got to save some stuff for other videos, right? Now, these 2 tactics of citing a ton of sources and also what's known as extra topicality, like going through all these different disciplines, really pair well together as a tactic to overwhelm your opponent and sort of overwhelm your audience. And he actually relies on his audience, first of all, being a lay audience. They're not specialists in any of the areas that he's talking about. In the Zindler debate, as a matter of fact, it's a friendly audience because this happened to be in a church, so he sort of had home field advantage. And essentially a lazy audience. I mean, these people are not going to start researching all of the stuff he talks about. There's too much of it in there. And one other important piece that was pointed out to me that I didn't pick up on right away is his use of the term the atheist. He's using this to other his opponent, to make him non-human I mean, certainly in this situation where he's talking with a religious crowd, he turns his opponent into the other and essentially dehumanizes and vilifies them, makes them part of the out group. And by creating a situation where his audience looks at his interlocutor as part of the out group, they are automatically inclined to reject the things he has to say. And this is especially true in this debate with Zindler, where he's talking in a church. But even outside of a church, where he's using this language of the atheist and othering them, even if it's a neutral audience, he still creates this idea of his opponent being the other and discrediting them that way instead of dealing with the substance of what they've brought to the discussion.
If Mr. Zindler wants us to believe atheism instead, then he's got to first tear down all of the evidence for Christianity which I've presented, and then in its place erect a case of his own which is more convincing for the truth of atheism. Unless and until he does that, then I think it's pretty clear which way the evidence points.
And now we see Craig's signature move in all of these debates. He goes about setting up the win-loss parameters for the debate. His opponent needs to tear down all 5 of Craig's points and in their place erect points of their own. What Craig is doing here is putting in place a metric to judge winning and losing the debate, because in Craig's mind, that's what this is all about, is winning and losing. And if he can set the terms by which the debate is won or lost, that puts him in the driver's seat, that puts him in control. And that's what he's trying to do here. And he'll come back to this and try and pay off with it later. Now we're going to move to Craig's first rebuttal section. So as a reminder, the structure of this debate is Dr. Craig's opening remarks, Frank Zindler's opening remarks, and then Craig's first rebuttal. And that's where we're coming into now.
You remember at the end of my speech, I suggested that if Mr. Zindler is to convince us that atheism is true, he's got to first destroy the evidence for Christianity that I presented, and then give us a case of his own that atheism is true. Unfortunately, he's declined in his opening speech to do either of those two things.
Now, this is the first tactic of Craig's that I really feel is duplicitous. Remember, this is the start of his first rebuttal. This is after Frank Zindler's opening, which would have been prepared before the debate. And notice the loaded language that Craig is using here. In his opening statement, Mr. Zindler has declined to do either of the things that Craig set up at the end of Craig's opening. So remember, he said he needs to tear down all the arguments for theism, or Christianity specifically. That's notable in this debate. And in their place, erect the case for atheism, using a different definition of atheism than Frank Zindler chooses to use. And it's, I hate to say almost offensive. It's ridiculous that Craig would say in the beginning of his rebuttal that Frank Zindler has not yet rebutted any of Craig's points, because that's not the purpose of an opening statement in these debates. You don't start rebutting your opponent's points until you get to your first rebuttal. But he's pointing at Mr. Zindler saying, look, in his opening, he didn't rebut any of my points. Again, I hate to call it dishonest or disingenuous. I don't think it is. It's strategic. And like I said, Craig is very good at this stuff, and it's a clever move. Let's move on to the next part.
Let's look first at the issue of definitions. Secondly, what about atheism? Well, I hate to correct him about his definition of atheism, but he's simply wrong. Atheism is not just the absence of belief in God. Let me turn to the standard work in the field of philosophy, standard reference work, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It quotes, according to the most usual definition, an atheist is a person who maintains that there is no God. In contrast, an agnostic maintains that it is not known or cannot be known whether there is a God. Mr. Zindler has clearly confused agnosticism with atheism. And the debate tonight is supposed to be over atheism, the proposition that there is no God. And so I invite him again, defend that point of view. I've come here to debate, give me some arguments for atheism so that I can deal with them.
So this point may be specific to this debate. I don't know how often Craig has or still does take this tactic. But here he is trying to force his definition of atheism on Mr. Zindler. And this is something that just annoys me to no end in the online debates and discussions that happen. When this whole atheism versus agnosticism gets raised, it always devolves into an argument over semantics, an argument over definitions. And that is exactly what Craig is doing here. He's trying to force a definition into the mix, into the debate, instead of actually dealing with the substance of what Frank Zindler has presented in his opening or in his rebuttals. I don't remember exactly where this takes place, but instead of dealing with the substance of what Mr. Zindler has to say, he's arguing over the definition of a word. And that is just pointless. It doesn't continue the conversation. It doesn't continue the dialogue. It shuts down the dialogue. And Craig knows that these words are used in nuanced ways. Even the definition that he read from the philosophical work said the most usual or the most common or most typical use of the word atheist is someone who believes that God does not exist. But that phrase, most common, implies that there's other ways to use this word, and Craig knows this, and he knows that Mr. Zindler doesn't do it this way. So let's move on to the next clip. Okay, so now we're moving to the closing statements, and here we're going to see Craig try to cash in on his setup from the opening.
In my final speech, I'd like to look at those two contentions that I began this evening with and see how they fared in the course of the debate. First, I allege that there's no good evidence that atheism is true. I think that has certainly been abundantly evidenced in tonight's debate. We've not heard a single argument to show that God does not exist.
And here we see Craig trying to cash in on the metric he set up in his opening about what it means to win or lose this debate, and also by the strawman use of a different definition of atheism than what Frank Zindler uses. And he said there's been no evidence presented. So under the metrics that I gave in the beginning of the debate, that means I win and he loses. Although every debate opponent would have to be judged separately about how much they address this point from Dr. Craig, the fact that he frequently opens his closing statements with this challenge that that my metric hasn't been met, that my win conditions haven't been met, shows that it's a regular part of his toolbox, and he will try to use it whenever possible. Now, I just wanted to end this video with my own personal thoughts about this particular debate. And again, this is an older one. This is from '93. It was done quite a few years ago. So I don't really mean to criticize either person in the debate. I'm looking at this more as a learning opportunity. What can we see that we think they did well? What can we see that we think they didn't do well? What kind of strategies and tactics are being used? Can we see those from other people in the future? So that's sort of my mindset on this. Now, Frank Zindler is not as polished a public speaker as William Lane Craig is, and it shows, and I think his performance in the debate is hurt because of that. His opening statement compared to Craig's, and Craig again has this script: thesis, supporting points, thesis. And it's very structured, it's very clean, it's very polished. He's been working with this material for a long time. Frank Zindler, on the other hand, his presentation came across as being somewhat rambling and unfocused. There were lots of pauses, there were ums and uhs, parts where the train was lost. And now, again, I'm not saying I could necessarily do better than Frank Zindler. Public speaking is a very difficult thing to do. It takes training and it takes practice. But it's the comparison between the two where he really seems to fall short. And this is not about the content of what he presented, which I'd like to move to now. Now, there's two places in this debate where I think the debaters really ended up talking past each other, and that's really not good for a debate. It's not good for the audience. It's not good for the quality of the debate you're presenting. And first, as I pointed out many times already, is the argument over the meaning of the word atheist, and Craig trying to force his meaning onto Mr. Zindler, knowing beforehand that Mr. Zindler doesn't use the term that way, and knowing that there are other nuanced ways to use the term. So instead of dealing with the substance, they end up talking past each other over the definition, and that really just doesn't get you anywhere. Now, the second place where they end up talking past each other, and this has to do with the setup of the debate, the initial question that's being debated, which is atheism versus Christianity, not versus theism, not versus deism, not versus God, but specifically Christianity. Now, if you look at Dr. Craig's presentation, he brings his 5 evidences. The cosmological argument, the Kalam, that he's obviously very familiar with, the argument from design, the argument from morality, the argument from the resurrection, and the last one, which isn't even actually an argument, and he admits this, and I'll get to this in the debate, the video I do for that specific portion of the debate, but the claim that you can have a personal experience of God. Now, of these 5 arguments, only one of them, the argument from the resurrection, is specific to Christianity. All the rest of them are applicable to essentially any faith, certainly any monotheistic faith. The cosmological argument doesn't even necessarily get you to a God. So on Craig's end, he's supposed to be defending Christianity, and instead he defends theism and just barely touches on Christianity. So realistically, that is the only pillar that Frank Zindler would need to attack, would be the argument from the resurrection. And if he can break that down, then we no longer have a firm case for Christianity, although we might still have a case for theism or deism. On Frank Zindler's side, despite the sort of unfocused nature of his presentation, it's not being as slick as Dr. Craig's, I think he did an excellent job of actually attacking some of the precepts of Christianity. Not just theism in general, not necessarily deism, but Christianity specifically. And you can watch the debate, you can see those in there. So I think Zindler actually brought better game in some senses to this. He was more focused in his opening statement on what he was trying to defend, but they talk past each other. Craig is trying to defend deism largely, or theism, sorry. He's largely trying to defend theism with a touch of Christianity there in the resurrection. And Zindler was specifically attacking Christianity and not necessarily attacking a generalized theism. So they end up talking past each other, and I think that's really a detriment to the debate. This is, as I've mentioned before, the very first of Craig's debates I ever saw. I wasn't impressed by Zindler then, and actually on the rewatch, he falls really short, and a lot of it, I think, has to do with his style of presentation, which was just much less focused, much less polished than Craig's. He was not coming looking at this as a competition to win or looking at it as a performance theater. He was coming to talk about ideas and debate ideas. And it's an unequal match, I think. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this. Maybe you learned something from it. I don't know, maybe not. The next video I'm going to do in this series is going to be on Craig's presentation of the cosmological argument. And I will use another video set of clips for that. This is going to be all of the Frank Zindler stuff that we're going to see. I'm planning right now, I think, on using the Sean Carroll debate for that. Because I think it specifically is around the cosmological argument. I have to rewatch the opening statements and see if that really is applicable. And if it is, that's the one I'm going to use. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. It's fine. I won't judge. Feel free to post in the comments if you think I've got anything wrong, if you think I'm being too harsh or not harsh enough on either person in this debate. If you think I've taken something out of context, feel free to let me know and watch the debate. I highly encourage it. Until next time, as always, be kind to one another and stay safe out there. That's why we record these prior. Now my hat's going to be misadjusted. All you guys are going to see my hat, and it's going to look different because I stood up and sat down. Man, the things I do.